Hello. Morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's session. So the first speaker for today is Professor Shihab Shamma from University of Maryland. Some of you have already been hearing from him and got a sense of what he's like. I think all of you already know that he's extremely approachable and knowledgeable about the auditory system and very easy to talk to. So please take advantage of his knowledge and his presence here. To briefly introduce him, Shihab received his BS degree from Imperial College London, and then his MS and PhD degrees in electrical engineering from Stanford, and interestingly also an MA in Slavic languages, which I was asking about, which apparently was his reason to get into speech processing. One of the very unique characteristics about Shihab's work is that he's really spanned the breadth from sort of the engineering side of speech recognition to the neuroscience side of it, and in a way that's really an inspiring example for many of us. Without further ado, welcome, Shihab.
Thanks. So I first have to start with an apology, since after all this speech about speech, I changed the talk to make it about music. It's still sound, and the reason is because we have so many distinguished people here who talked about speech and how speech is processed and all that. So I thought I would just complement it a little bit, since a lot of the mechanisms involved and so on are the same. You won't lose much on the auditory aspect, but music still has a lot of unique things about it, so I thought it might be fun for you to hear about it. Okay, so I guess one of the main things that we would like to know about music, okay, speech we all know. You're born and you will speak. Whether you like it or not, even if there's nobody around you talking, you can talk to a tree by moving your hands and doing stuff. People have done experiments where they got deaf people in a place where nobody taught them at all anything about language and communicating, and they developed a language. It's completely built in, the desire and the ability to speak, to have a language, and normally for humans, the communication, linguistic communication is done, of course, with speech. But music is not so clear. So there's always the question of whether this is cultural acquisition or is it something unique to humans, in the sense that we have developed in evolution, and humans have this sort of intrinsic desire and ability to do music. Clearly, there are a lot of aspects of music being a sound that are perceptual attributes that are common to all other sounds, like environmental sounds and speech, and they can be readily inferred from neuroscience data. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. However, there's something very important about music, which is that there are a lot of unique aspects about musical systems across the world that seem to be completely shared for no good reason. There are people in islands that make music that have very corresponding or similar kind of structure to music developed in Europe and music developed in India. Why? Is there something special about the auditory system that make higher level organization of music similar? And of course, the emotional aspect of music also is very important. So these have to be also studied, but obviously at a much higher level. And finally, where do you draw the line between the two? Often in speech, I remember even in I was going to say the short lifespan that I've had, but relative to humans, the long lifespan that I had, what was basic when I started and higher level has really changed dramatically. And nowadays, we call a lot of stuff that we find in the cortex very basic, when basic used to be just the cochlea. And so there is a line where the more we know, the more basic it becomes, and it becomes something low level, and the rest of the stuff is all high level. Okay, so let me start by telling you about music and all that. I'm going to move a little bit fast in this part because I want to get to the higher level aspect. So this picture is of the schematic of the auditory system. There's cochlea and then many processing stages all the way up to the cortex. Many, many parallel pathways come out, and we don't really know exactly why, but probably a lot of the attributes that we associate with speech and music are extracted along the way in these different structures, and all the way up to the cortex and even in the primary auditory cortex. So early in the auditory system in the cochlea, we have the spectrogram, and I don't need to elaborate on the spectrogram. You've heard enough about it. And that's somewhere in here, there is already a spectrogram, and that's fed to other things. So to extract what things? For example, pitch of a sound. You all know what a pitch of a sound is. Timbre, the quality of a sound, what distinguishes violin from a piano, and so on. Location is another important. Loudness, and a whole lot of other things. You get beyond the auditory, early auditory parts. You heard from Christoph Kleiner, for example, about a lot of the organization and the processing in the primary auditory cortex. But as he mentioned, there are a lot of other areas that the primary auditory cortex feeds into, which are the secondary, tertiary, and all of these respond in a successive way to more and more complex elaborations of the acoustic signal. And in the case of a brain of a ferret, there's the auditory area, all the way up to the prefrontal cortex, where when you present a sound, you get big auditory responses all the way up here. But as you move up the chain, things become more and more complicated in the sense that it's just like if you look at this schematic, when you are in the primary auditory area or just before, things are narrowly tuned. The cells and their responses, for example, look over a narrow range of frequencies, just like in the visual system where you have the receptive fields to space tend to be narrow. And then as you move up, they become broader and broader, and they become more like here the picture I draw is of a interaction that is a neuron. For example, the green neuron here is picking out information from wherever it can along this axis, in this case the frequency axis. So you see it adds up information from this side and this side to respond and give this stimulus a meaning, like go drink, as opposed to don't drink. This is a warning signal. So, and when we record in these higher level areas, if you just look at the red curve compared to the blue curve, for example, you see that in the lower areas, the differences between warning sounds, which are the responses in the red, versus the safe sounds, which are the responses in the blue, tend to be quite distinguished. This difference becomes smaller as you go earlier in the auditory system. In fact, if you go to the cochlea, there's absolutely no difference. If it's the same sound, even if it's a tone associated with warning and another associated with safe, the responses are the same. But as you go to higher level areas, there's a difference. And when you go just to the next stage, the tertiary area, the difference becomes huge. And as you go to the prefrontal cortex, which is this other area I told you about, they only respond basically to meaning of the sound. Is it no go or go? Okay? So let me skip this and let me move on now to talk about what I mean by these perceptual attributes. And first of all, pitch. So I'm going to talk only about pitch and timbre in the interest of time and explain to you how these basic attributes are used and extracted in music. So as you know, in this is a speech spectrogram because people are familiar with the speech, but speech and music share pretty much the same things for pitch and timbre. And that is, when you look at the spectrogram, you see all these harmonics of a common fundamental which we associate with the pitch of a voice. So a female would have a higher pitch than my voice, and all of these harmonics of a fundamental frequency. So my you may get, for example, all of these, this is on a logarithmic frequency axis, all of these harmonics would shift up for a female. If you look at these harmonics and you look at their spacing and all of that stuff, it turns out that the pitch is extracted from exactly these harmonics. They are the low harmonics in the stimulus. This is a broadband stimulus here. And it's the low harmonics that are extracted from musical pitch and melodies and so on. If you do not have low order harmonics, and I mean by that the lower 8 to 10, for example, then your ability to hear a melody is highly, highly degraded. You just don't have really good sense of a melody without these harmonics that are resolved, and you can see them clearly separately. Contrast that with this region here. So in this region, you see the harmonics get closer and closer, so they're far apart, and then they become closer and closer, and here they are completely together. These are the formats of the stimulus. So there are a whole lot of harmonics buried in here. And in this region, pitches also can be extracted, but it's much worse resolution, and we just don't really hear music much with this kind of pitch up there. So pitch is a very complicated story. It's been studied for literally 150 years now, and we still don't really have, we have a lot of schools of thought about it, models, literally tens of models, tons of data, but no definitive story about how pitch is extracted in mammals. So I'm not going to waste your time with that, except to tell you that it seems that when you go to higher levels, and by the way, pitch is extracted very likely pretty early in the auditory system, by the midbrain, something like that, because a lot of the information you need is lost otherwise. But when you go up to the cortex, you see that pitch has been probably extracted and mapped out. So if you do fMRIs, for example, or you do single unit recordings, so for example, Xiaoxing Wang did single unit recordings in the marmosets, thank you, in the marmosets, and found pitch selective neurons in the low frequency regions of the auditory cortex of the marmoset, and Sam Norman Henier, he did fMRI in humans, and has seen the telltale signs of pitch maps in the auditory cortex of humans. Now, maps don't tell you how it's extracted. It's the end result of it all. But nevertheless, it seems that it's there, it's important. We know it's important because pitch is extremely important for many tasks, not just music. But of course, in music, it's the key carrier of melody, but we use it in order to separate sound sources and do all kinds of other things. Timbre. Timbre is a more complicated story. When you distinguish between a violin and a piano, that's what we call timbre, although they're playing, for example, the same pitch, the same loudness, from the same exact location, and so on. And if you hear the sound compared to this, everybody knows immediately this is a piano and that's a violin. And there are two key features, the reasons for that. One is if you look at the spectrogram of the violin, and when you heard it, you heard the vibrato on it, that's temporal modulations. And those are, we're very sensitive to those. Those are extracted. And in the piano, on the other hand, there's none of that. There's a very rapid onset and a rapid decay. And it's a percussive instrument, kind of. And if you look at across the frequency axis, you see a completely different distribution of harmonic structure. So the harmonics of a violin have an envelope that is quite complicated because the resonance cavities of the violin are really, really complicated compared to the piano, which is just the big box. And the envelope is very smooth. Okay, these kinds of features are extracted in the cortex. They're obviously available already in the spectrogram, but by the time you get to the cortex, there are machinery, receptive fields, neurons that are sensitive to these spectral and temporal modulations. They are responsive to these. They put them all together in a display, which looks, for those of you who've been yesterday here in Stefan Malaz's talk, when he talked about the scattering transform, this is literally a scattering transform, where you have basically the bandwidth axis and the temporal axis, the modulation rate axis and frequency axis. And there are probably many other dimensions, like space perhaps, and loudness, we don't know, and even pitch. And all of these get added up in a multidimensional representation that evolves as a function of time. So the way to look at the cortex is when you're playing sound is that you have just this cloud of activity that is evolving over time along all these different axes, and we get to pick and choose what we listen for and integrate. In music, if you collapse these dimensions into just two, which is the bandwidth axis, or we call the scale, or the rate, which is the modulations in time, you see that the patterns produced by different instruments are really different. For example, a violin has strong activations at modulations in time that are of the order of 6 hertz, which reflects the vibrato, compared to a piano, which has none of these, clarinet, oboe. Presumably, something like this distribution of activity is really what tells you that this is a violin, this is a piano, when you hear it. And you can use these patterns to create metrics, timbre metrics between instruments. And of course, we still tell a violin it's a violin regardless of the pitch that it plays and regardless of its loudness. So all these things should be stable with respect to pitch and loudness and so on. There's been a fair amount of work, especially led by Munia al-Hilali at Hopkins, where they did psychoacoustic, and Daniel Presnitzer at ENS, where he did psychoacoustics, asking people to tell the difference between two notes played on a piano versus saxophone or a marimba and a vibraphone and so on and so forth. And you can measure these distances, and that tells you how people are perceiving timbre on many dimensions for 12 different instruments. And from that, we can see if the neural data or a model of how cortical processing happens can predict this kind of a confusion matrix. So that's our ground truth, and this is the proof that the truth is what it is. Okay, so that's the timbre, that's pitch. These are really basic features. Immediately the question comes up. Come on, you're recording in a ferret brain. What's that got to do with music? And what's so special about music? Music and speech, I just told you, have shared pitch, shared timbre, shared loudness, and all that. Are there separate maps for music and pitch? Is the representation music fundamentally different than speech? Well, this is a picture just gives you a feel for the representation of speech in the auditory cortex of a ferret. And you may immediately say, well, what's the ferret got to do with speech? But we try to brush this under the rug, and we see that the representation or the activations generated by, for example, different vowels and all of that in a ferret are quite complex. And Nima Masgarani, who did all these recordings, will, I hope you'll talk about this tomorrow. Good. All right, he's got to talk for 5 hours, so I'm going to leave him something to talk about. He also trained the ferrets very nicely to discriminate between speech sounds and create confusion matrices between these different sounds. And he showed that, in fact, humans and ferrets, neural data have quite similar confusion matrices, just like I showed you for the music between humans and the models, for example. But is speech and music, are they any different? What, are there different areas in the brain that respond, for example, to music only and to speech only? So this has been addressed in humans by fMRI, again with Sam. One of the really interesting results that they found is, in fact, there are, while the auditory areas of the brain do respond strongly to both speech and music, there are few regions at the edges of this auditory area that respond selectively to either speech or music. Okay? So there are regions that are music selective and speech selective. We don't really know why. These experiments, they have a lot of limitations because you're using fMRI, you're putting complex music and complex sounds and all that stuff. This would be a heck of a lot easier if the ferret had a music selective. And I mean, you laugh, but listen, dogs live with people all the time. And Annie Patel told me, have you recorded in dogs? I said, I have had enough time recording in a mouse even. With animal rights. Get a dog in there, it's almost a human. And dogs listen to music and with their in their homes. Maybe they developed also music and speech. Selective areas, who knows? Nima is doing recordings in humans, but now these are much nicer recordings in the sense that while they don't give you the overall view that you get with the fMRI, they give you much sharper view with electrodes placed on top of the or inside the brain of a human. And you can record the responses to just, for example, a variety of music and speech. And Nima, you're going to talk about this? No. All right. So, for example, he generously gave me this response. If you just focus on this one here, this is patient number 25, and you're looking at the responses here for different electrodes. So there's 60-something electrodes here, and for different samples of speech and different samples of music. And you see very clearly that exactly the same electrode here responds pretty much only to speech, and it doesn't respond at all to music. And when I say to music, this is not just putting some music that this patient didn't like. This is a variety of music from different genres and so on. And there's clear this, and the regions in red and in white are supposed to signify the regions selective to music only or to speech only. And yeah, so the question is, what about ferrets? Would they have these kinds of regions? What about humans that are naive to music? They just haven't heard music and all that. What about selectivity? Is it some indication of skill, of how much you love the music, or experience, and so on? Yeah.
Is the selectivity just because of spectral filtering?
We don't know. Nobody has looked at this yet. Yeah. I mean, immediately the question is, well, is there some difference in the overall spectral characteristics? Or, I mean, if you have to place a bet, I bet it is, but yeah, anyway. One nice way of doing this, really the right way, is to do it the way Yves, who will be speaking today or tomorrow, with Cillian and Michael Tanter, using ultrasound. This is a technique. It's like the fMRI, except it's functional ultrasound imaging instead of. The way it works is that you open up the brain and then you just send the ultrasound and then get the reflections, and then you can measure the blood flow. And in that sense, it gives you. It's a benchtop technique, so it's not as elaborate as the fMRI. It's perfect for small animals like ferrets and so on. It has pretty good spatial resolution in 100 microns or so. And you can do it in a passive or a behaving animal, so you can have the animal learn a piece of music and recognize it and behave to it, and then measure whether the responses change in a way that reflects their appreciation of this music. You could do it over many periods, months or weeks and so on. So this is really the way to go after this question for small animals. And I mean, you could do fMRI too, but this is much, much more convenient and has a lot of other advantages. Now, let me get to the question of higher level stuff. So music is not about just, it's acoustics and all that stuff. Nobody is going to sit there and dance to the sound of a car or these horns out in the street or appreciate them. However, we do learn a lot of stuff, whether we like it or not. And we learn, I'm just going to focus on the huge range of things that one can talk about in learning, between really extended long-term learning, like plasticity and all that stuff, and even kind of pushing towards development, and all the way to the very rapid things that happen while you're behaving and learning. But I'm going to talk about just very briefly about 3 kinds of acquisition of information or learning. One is the implicit acquisition or implicit learning, one that is associated usually with just sitting around and being exposed to things. So there's nothing, you learn enormous amount about that. The mention of dogs here is to remind me that about dogs, for example, by exposure in a house as a pet, may have developed a lot of the things that we see in humans about music. Contextual effects or contextual learning, we never almost hear anything without its context to give it a meaning. And in music, there's a lot of context. And I'll explain that. And, and how ambiguous percepts in music, for example, are used a lot in order to convey messages and emotions and so on. And finally, selective learning is basically when you are selectively attending to one out of many and segregate. So let me talk first about implicit learning and what do I mean by that. So implicit learning is like an infant is born and they begin to acquire language. You're not sitting around all day giving them grammar lessons and all that. You just talk. And within a few months, infants learn the phonemes of their language. How do we know that? You can bring infants and you can expose them to, for example, phonemes from Tamil, for example, or since I was in Chennai just now, sorry. I know I should probably say here. Well, whatever language. And English or French, and they react in a way that clearly shows that they distinguish phonemes in their own native tongue, but not, or what they get listened to, but not in a foreign language. Within a few months, they do that already. And they slowly begin to absorb learn syllables and words and so on. And for those of you who learn a new language, I know in India it's not a big deal to speak 5 languages. I went on a trip with this kid, IIT Chennai, not Chennai, Guwahati, and this guy spoke 8 languages. And I saw him switch between 5 different languages without blinking because his mother spoke 2 languages and in certain contexts spoke in one and others spoke in the other. His father spoke a different language. And school and the national language is just unbelievable. This is in the Northeast. They have so many languages. It's just fascinating up there. Anyway, so it's no big deal. But if you learn a new language as an adult, one of the most difficult things is to segment the language. You hear somebody and it just sounds like blah, 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 blah. You don't know the beginning of a word and the end of another word. It's just like, how about putting some pauses so I can follow? And infants do that, and they do it. Why? How do they do this? Well, one possibility is that they hear the same word repeated in many different contexts, and they get repeated exposure, and that's how they know these different syllables belong together in many different, and so it's a word. And in many In music, this is used as a technique all the time. So when you listen to a phrase in music, and if it's repeated 3, 4, 5 times, you begin to become familiar with it, and you appreciate it. And we just listened to a performance of Raga in Chennai, and it was really fascinating, because I have not heard, obviously, that one Raga before, but within a few minutes, you feel the phrase, and I really wanted to sing it again, because every time she sang it is with a different embellishments and so on, and it was just beautiful. And it was exactly what Bach does with his fugues, where he takes one little phrase, or they call it the subject, and then he repeats it in many different ways and versions and different keys and so on and so forth. So this is a very important technique to make you like music. Because we hear something repeated, we begin to like it and like it more, and we acquire it. Just very briefly, you can do this even with just samples of noise. And experiments at ENS by Daniel Presnitzer and his group showed that, in fact, if I take a sample, just a sample of noise, white noise, like this, and if I take it exactly the same and I play it to you, you acquire it and you store it for weeks. And if you can design the experiment correctly, you can show that, in fact, you remembered exactly that sample and not another sample. Like sh and sh. Those are completely different samples. They have different waveforms. But if I repeat one of them 5 times, you acquire it. Okay, so all of this is being studied and has been studied for a long time, especially in songbirds, because this is the work of Vicario's group and Kai Lu, where they exposed the bird to a sequences of sounds here represented by color. So 10, 11, 8, da-da-da. All these different words are this, 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 this. And a word is defined as a sequence of sounds that stick together all the time. And when they exposed the bird to these words, and they tested them on non-words, just random, the neurons don't respond to these as well. And they don't respond even to parts of words. For example, if you take these and play them together, because this doesn't repeat often, because you can take this word and put it in different contexts, this is nothing special. It's like the end of one word and the beginning of another word. You know they don't belong together. And the bird does not respond to that. So this kind of implicit learning, the bird was not told, these are words, you better remember them, otherwise you get your food or you don't get your food. So this is quite accessible, this implicit learning and all that. Another one is contextual effects and ambiguous perception. And an example of that is everybody here can see that there are 2 ways to view this. And it's called the visual bistability, in which you can have basically a view of this as 2 faces or a vase. There are millions of illusions like that in visual. In auditory visual, this is a really famous one, the McGurk effect. Everybody here seen this before? Okay, who has not seen it before? Oh my goodness, okay. So this is really fun, it's very powerful. You will watch it, and this gentleman here is going to say either da or ba. And what I'd like you to do is when he says the first time, he says, keep your eyes open and watch him. And did everybody hear the da, 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 da? Is it louder? You need it.
Ba, 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 ba.
You heard it? Okay, now close your eyes and hear it again.
Ba, 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 ba.
You heard it, ba, 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 ba. Now close and open halfway through.
Ba, 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 ba.
When I saw this first, I was convinced there was a camera in the room watching me. I was shaking. There's no way it could fool me so much. But this is very powerful. It just shows you that when you're perceiving things on the fly, you're adjusting your perception according to the inputs and the context in which you, in this case, the context would have been, or the cues that are coming in is from the mouth and the way we place it, and the acoustics. And it's the acoustics that are ambiguous enough that they can be biased one way or the other. It's a very powerful technique when you want to write music also. And this is an example which, how many have not heard this before? Have not heard this demo? Okay, just very quickly. You hear a sequence of sounds and then focus on the last one. Oops. Did you hear the pitch of the last two go up? I'll play it one last time. Okay, and now I'll play it again, but the last two. Did you hear the last two? They went down. The last two were identical, completely identical. And the pitch of the pitch change now, this is pitch, this is melody, this was actually a nice melody. And you play the same two notes at the end, and they're heard as either going up or going down. And it's, again, imagine you're playing a scale. And by the time you get to the sixth note in the scale, you're in the context of that scale. And you must be affected how you hear that note compared to hearing it as a first note or so on. And in fact, there are different keys like that. And so the perception of music and of speech is very much contextual. And you can study it in amps. By the way, ferrets turn out to actually also hear the illusion the same way. And you can do experiments on them with these shepherd, they're called the shepherd tones, those ambiguous tones. And we actually did a whole lot of experiments that are with Bernard Englitz and in ferrets and humans with Sahar Akram. And you see very parallel results when it comes to the way the responses reflect the percepts of the illusion going up or down and so on. So this is something fundamental in the I think I'll skip this. Let me just, because of the interest in time. So let me go to now the third aspect, which is selective learning. That is to say, when you're listening to an orchestra, an expert listener doesn't listen the same way as a naive listener. A naive listener may just listen to the whole thing and just say, there's a whole lot of people making a lot of different sounds. And on the other hand, if you're listening as an expert violinist, for example, you selectively pick the sound of the violin coming out of this complex orchestra, or if you're interested in the choir and you want to listen to it, and you can segregate these into separate streams and hear one and ignore all the others. Musical listening is so much about that, about playing this game of segregating, putting together different instruments, listening to the harmonies, and the players do that all the time. So in the raga performance, for example, there were 3 people performing, 2 instrumentalists and the singer, and you can see this dynamic of trying to synchronize their music, their performance, and it's exquisite in its precision and the way they obviously are listening to each other and being able to selectively attend. How do we do this? Well, we do this in speech all the time. You're listening to people and talking. It's called the famous cocktail party. And Nima will tell you all about that. I know he will. Okay. All I can tell you is we've looked at it in we're looking at these now in ferrets, actually teaching ferrets words, and ferrets are able to do this quite easily, actually. Once they recognize that they need to listen to a particular word, then you can just put a whole lot of different speech with it, simultaneous with it, and you can record in single neurons in the brain of the ferret as it's listening for the word or it's not listening to the word. And you see that the representation changes in a way that is quite similar to what Nima is going to show you tomorrow. No, Friday. And the basic idea that comes out of that is that we use the timing, just like those raga singers were doing. And the timing is critical for combining and knowing what belongs together and what doesn't belong together. The short story is that what belongs together are things that start and end at the same time, constantly over time. And they're temporally coherent. And those tend to be segregated from things that don't. And so you can build a computational model. This is this part I've already described, where you take the spectrogram, you create the multidimensional or the wavelet transform, or we call it the cortical representation. And then what you do is you look for the coincidence across these zillion channels. So you build these giant matrices of coincidences, basically neurons that look across scales, cross rates, cross frequencies, and then segregate the ones that belong together from the ones that don't. And it's a pretty straightforward algorithm. To do this, this is work of Lakshmi Krishnan. We also showed that this same algorithm, working with the scattering coefficients that Stefan Mallat described yesterday, and using the ideas of rigid motion in vision, work in very similar way. So we segregate visual scenes in a very similar manner. Okay. Jonathan Simon has been doing a lot of experiments, and also in MEG and EEG and so on, where you can actually demonstrate now. You don't have to open up the head of a human to do that. You can just record from there, from just the, from a cap, electrodes right on the skull, and then you can just see completely the telltale signs of what people are paying attention to. Do they pay attention to speaker A, speaker B? This is a problem, right? Because if we often like to not tell people whether we're paying attention or not. And if you walk around with a cap over your head that tells you, it points at who you're paying attention to, one of the projects that we had was actually to use that pointer to basically control a hearing aid. And then the hearing aid can aim the microphone at whoever you want to pay attention to. So the idea is to use the EEG. And the EEG is then controlling you decode from it what the direction that you want to pay attention to, and then aim the microphone of the hearing aid to listen to the music or to the speech and so on. So these ideas and these kinds of algorithms and all that stuff are quite realistic, and I really think some versions of these things will be out used by people in a decade or so, within this decade. Which decade are we? Forget. We're kind of in the middle of the decade. So, okay, let me finish with imagery and auditory motor learning. And why I bring this up is now we're going a little bit even further. So now, okay, let me give you the background of this story. There's this, a teenage kid who I knew who was a really good musician, a pianist. And he used to play a long time, plays all different pieces and stuff like that. And he turns out to have epileptic seizures. And one of the people who work in really one of the leaders in this field nowadays is Eddie Chang at UCSF, where Christoph Schreiner comes from, his colleague in the... And I called Eddie and said, I know you do this kind of work. Do you think you want to, treat him and all that? And by the way, this guy is a musician, so you can actually do experiments on music with him. So the reason is, for those of you who don't know, but Nima is going to explain much more tomorrow, is that you have these patients sitting in the hospital for a while, and they kind of get bored with the electrodes over their heads, and they're waiting for them to have a seizure. And then they would, because they want to know where the seizure begins and ends and all that stuff. And once you map it, then the surgeon pretends they know where they're going, and they scoop out the part that is the problem. And that really works. And Eddie is a remarkable surgeon who's been doing miracles, and he did a miracle with this kid too, because this kid turns out to have seizures that are everywhere, and it had to be very careful. In fact, they didn't have to wait very long for the operations. But what they had long enough that they recorded in his brain while he was playing a piano, a piece that he knew well. If I play it, then we'll probably stop listening and just listen to the beautiful music. So I won't. It's a beautiful Bach. Anyway, so what happened is they recorded from these electrodes while the patient was listening to the music as he played, and then when he just played but without any sound. And he was even imagining the music. Okay? So you can record the electrical activity, and you can reconstruct back what the spectrogram or what the sound looks like and so on. So you can do all control studies. So what they found is that when he played with the sound present, you get a certain activation, and you get pretty much the same activation when there was no sound at all. So the hypothesis is that what happened is when you actually associate auditory and motor in a strong way like this kid had with his skillful practice for a long time, you create these, become permanent essentially, that get activated only during listening, during playing or during listening, even when you're imagining. And they did some really careful experiments, and this is not published yet, and they were kind to show me their sort of figures from the paper, but it's coming out soon, and they have traces showing you exactly what happens to the auditory area when there is no sound at all, and how similar the responses are with and without. Yeah.
Only for that subject, is it? The one who had seizures.
Yeah. This is recorded from the subject, but do they have other subjects?
No, the previous slide.
It's the same subject.
Oh, it's the same subject.
Yeah.
So this fellow has seizures.
Well, you're absolutely right. So he has seizures. When they record, normally they don't have seizures. So with these human subjects, when they're in the hospital, they're waiting there without seizures. They're perfectly normal, awake and everything. And they can play music with their head open and all that. And they don't have any seizures, and you can get very nice recordings. The problem is, this particular case, this kid has seizures almost continuously. And so the recordings weren't the best. And they did, I think, other subjects, so I don't have the data on those. So I'm done. I can just finish the slide, and then we can, yeah, go ahead.
And I feel like this activation is also true of like other motor skills, not just when you're playing music, right? Like,
Yes. You mean if you do motor visual, for example. If you play video games.
video games, exactly.
Exactly. Yeah, video games are notorious. They really eat up your brain and change it completely. Apparently in a good way. I mean, I have a colleague who's studied this issue for a long time, and every time she looked at the data, there was no ifs or buts about it. The kids who played video games had better attentional skills. She tried to tried to find an explanation other than that. And anyway, so just one final slide. I started by asking whether this is nature or nurture. So let me just comment on a few examples that are really striking, that just don't make any sense, and we still have a long way to figure out what's going on. Like scales, musical scales. Those of you who play music know that all musical systems have scales. You know, C major, minor scales, and so on and so forth. And just about everywhere in the world, when they have scales, like on a piano keyboard, you know there are the keys that are the black and the white, and it's because the scales tend to have either steps that are 2 or 1. And there's a pattern to that. Either there's octave and it's 12 semitones, and then a scale, you pick 7 of them in Western scales, and then you play the scales. And the scales these sequence of notes feel very natural, but some of them have spacings of 2, and some of them have spacings of 1 semitone. All right. And yeah, major and minor scales have slightly different patterns, but this kind of idea seems to be everywhere in the world. Almost all scales in the world. The exception is, for example, gamelan music in Indonesia, where you have uniform scale. That is equal, the scale has equal distances. Why is it that some scales they call symmetric, which is uniform, like this one, but pretty much everybody else uses the asymmetric scales? There's really no good explanation. There's a lot of hypotheses. There are a lot of experimental work going on. But if you teach a naive subject music, expose them only to uniform scales, would they acquire uniform scales and comfortably work with them? All these are open questions. Dissonance and consonance. We all know when you play a melody and one note is off, even if you haven't heard the melody, you feel it. And musical experts can immediately spot it and feel really good or bad or whatever, but they feel something. What is dissonance and consonance? Is this some universal concept? Is the explanation of dissonant sound in Western music the same as in Eastern music? And actually experiments have just been done, and they were just published in, I think, in Nature, where they went to the Amazon. You have to go really far. In Bolivia, with a tribe that have no exposure to Western music and all that, and checked, do they feel the same way about Western dissonance and consonance? And they discovered, no, they couldn't care less. So this obviously points to dissonance being a nurture thing. It's a learned thing. But up until this point, we all thought, in fact, there was a good reason why dissonant sounds are dissonant. Because of the beating they get between the different components and harmonics and so on and so forth. And as you put them in a sequence, you inherit that from the simultaneous. In any case, another open question, but it seems to point now to learn. People are working on rhythms, and this is a fantastic, the way humans deal with rhythms, and the complexity of the rhythms in a raga is just... And language, they have very different stress patterns, which is sort of an analogous thing to rhythm. And when somebody who is a native speaker of French speaks English, it's really difficult to get rid of the stress patterns of French into English or vice versa. And many different languages, all different in their stress patterns and so on. So obviously this issue is one that is more to do with what you acquire rather than... And musical appreciation. This is a big unknown. Why is it that we like certain phrases in music and react to them? People have theorized about this for a long time, and they have these sort of... This is the strongest, the best theory I know of, that is where there are certain patterns of what they call tension and release, which make you feel in a certain way in certain phrases, but not others. But what is the biological basis of this? And is it really, does it exist in all animals? Or do we just exploit it in order to feel music? Or does it build in as an ability that comes with music? When we listen to music, we begin to learn how to feel this music with the so-called tension release episodes. So, I'm done. If somebody had a question, I'm sorry I had to put you. But if you have any questions now, this is summary of what I told you. I don't need to bother you repeat it again. So I'd be happy to take any questions you have. Yeah. There's a microphone behind you, and keep the microphone away.
So you said that there were some parts of the brain that responded specifically to music and some specifically to speech. So the parts of the brain that respond specifically to music, do we know that it's that they're responding to music or to something that's simply not speech?
It's a good question. I want to say it was tested for music. There was a huge battery of sounds, and the two experiments are different. There was the speech music, and then there was the other one to do with pitch, and then, okay, now I remember. There was a huge variety of sounds, including environmental sounds and so on, and the regions that were classified as music selective responded supposedly only to music. Now, don't ask me the obvious question, is singing speech or music? Or what kind of, some music sounds like noise and more like car horns. But aside from that, it was obvious that these specific regions, these small regions, responded selectively to music and nothing else. Yeah. Miraj? I can't hear you.
So when we do experiment for speech perception in auditory cortex, generally we focus on intelligibility of the phoneme, whether the auditory cortex responds to the phoneme or not. So the main focus may be the spectral nature of the signal. But for music, doing with 2 seconds of music notes may not be, I don't know, is that the right way? Because music, we need some duration to get a meaningful concept out of the signal, which evokes some emotion in the brain. So it may be responding to the spectrum of the signal. So how do we disambiguate whether it is responding to the spectrum of the signal or some concept the music is trying to evoke?
The same way you do it with speech. I mean, are we responding to the acoustics of the phoneme or to the phoneme as a concept?
Yeah, but
and Nima will talk about this a lot. But there is a difference between the two, I agree. And you want me to give you an answer?
Yeah, so
the trouble with music is that because it's only in humans, it's not easy to do experiments. And so it's not even easy to do a recording from a single neuron, other than these neurons these are not even neurons. Those were electrodes in the ECOG. And there's not even recordings from humans in these epilepsy experiments on music. There are very few. And it's just now happening. So we'll have to wait. But I suspect it will be very much parallel to what you have in speech.
And one more question, if I can.
Sir.
Yes, please.
Sir, I have two questions. One is, it is said in the psychology that music therapy is there for the subjects who are suffering from some disease which are like mental oriented. Like, so what is something in that it helps them to cure a little bit, like a music therapy for subjects who are suffering from some mental illness?
You're asking me what is about music that helps these?
That helps them to
the same way as when you do talking therapy. You talk to people and you influence them and you convey to them certain feelings. You evoke in them certain feelings because of the semantics and the power of the expression in speech or in music. Or, not all music is going to work. It has to be related to the experience of the person, the sick person, and so on.
Right. Yeah, Sir, there is
sorry, I have to interrupt, but we have time for one other question, and then you can take other questions over tea.
Okay. So, some of the data that you showed on your slides showed that animals have like an intrinsic ability to recognize speech and also music, right? That even though they don't have a sense of language, they're still able to differentiate between speech and like random noise and music, especially in ferrets. I mean, and even when you showed that, I was thinking of dogs because they've like evolved with us, so they probably have a better sense of appreciation for the difference between words and sounds.
I'm not sure it's been shown.
Okay.
What you said. We can record in the brains of ferret. We can train them to discriminate sounds, and we can even, you know, dogs can easily memorize. Some dogs can
Hundreds of words.
memorize 100 words.
Yeah.
Right? These experiments have been done. So that's not language, but nevertheless, they treat speech sounds like we treat all kinds of novel sounds. That are, yeah. So music is the same in speech in that respect for an animal.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's thank Shihab for a wonderful lecture, and let's go to the next one. So it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker for this morning. This is